Mr. Lee Bratcher, thank you so much for joining me today and being a playable character in a sea of non-playable characters, someone who can critically think. I appreciate you, sir, for coming on today.
Yeah, Brandon, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I was joking with everybody. It's the NPC meme of people that can't think, and there's many reasons for that nowadays. But I appreciate you. I got to meet you a couple months ago at BitBlock Boom in Dallas, and I always love coming down to Texas. And you came up and introduced yourself to me, so I appreciate you doing that. And I was thinking, like, man, I would love to have Leon. And we kind of, I think, briefly talked about it there, and just kind of explain what we were talking offline a little bit. One, what's on your mind right now? Like, what's some of the stuff that you're just, it can be mining related stuff, but what's the thing that's really been taking up a lot of your time? And also just explain to people what's going on in the mining world, the impacts that it's having just on a general basis. We'll get into that, obviously, but obviously the big news is the political stuff going on. Politicians seemingly, really both sides. It's a political thing, but both sides are doing it now. Like, both sides are like, oh, we love it, and this side's coming out forward, and now the other side's flip. So I would love for you to kind of give your high level analysis, your expert analysis on what you've kind of seen. You guys, again, ERCOT, everything that's been the kind of the center of what's going on. So I would love you kind of just to kind of flow with what you've been thinking and what you guys have been seeing at the council there.
Sure. Yeah, we had a lot of our members at the Mar-a-Lago meeting where Trump came out in favor of Bitcoin mining, and now Bitcoin has been part of his stump speech. Now he's talking about ending the Biden administration's war on crypto, like in his speeches. So hopefully he brings that out in the debate next week or later this week, actually. With regard to Bitcoin mining, Texas has been roughly around 40 to 45% of the U.S. hash rate for the last several years. And we've had a favorable regulatory climate here, not really more favorable than any other industry. It's just a business-friendly climate in Texas, right? So Bitcoin miners don't receive any subsidies or any special treatment from the Texas legislature or the regulatory bodies here. What we have found recently, though, is with the uptick in demand for high performance computing, whether that's Bitcoin mining or AI or just cloud computing data centers, Texas has an incredible amount of load that's wanting to interconnect to the grid. And with that comes some challenging narratives and some backstabbing and some poisoning of the water for Bitcoin miners. So over the last year, some of these other load types and some other folks that really don't believe in Bitcoin and see no value in Bitcoin have been working behind the scenes to poison the water about Bitcoin mining with the Texas legislators. So when Trump came out and tweeted that he wants all the Bitcoin to be mined in the U.S., I thought that was, very helpful for us because Texas is a red state, and many of the elected officials here will see that, and that could sway their opinion a little bit. But there is such a strong feeling particularly amongst the Texas Senate, that energy is a zero-sum game. They don't really understand the concept of curtailable loads and the fact that you really aren't adding to the energy grid's demand unless you're adding to peak demand. If you're adding to times when there's sufficient amount of energy, there's a surplus of energy, 99% of the time there's a surplus of energy. And it's only that less than 1% of the time where you're hitting peak demand where there's constraint and you have to have ERCOT call on their ancillary services reserves or there are other tools or levers that they can pull. So what we found, though, is that Bitcoin miners are so efficient in those markets and they curtail quite effectively relative to other heavy industries that those other industries don't like Bitcoin mining. They don't like Bitcoin mining because we're more efficient at curtailing. They also don't like us because we're competing with them for interconnection slots and for real estate and places that are geographically aligned that can interconnect to the grid and places where you could build a data center, whether that be a tier 1 data center or a tier 3 AI data center. So we actually have our work cut out for us in the Texas legislature, despite the positive movement on the federal front. The Texas Lieutenant Governor came out last week or the week before actually it was the week before, very antagonistic and anti-Bitcoin mining. And so the Lieutenant Governor of Texas presides over the Texas Senate, and the Senate as a whole has not been favorable, even though people like Governor Abbott and Senator Ted Cruz and several of our allies in the Texas House have been favorable. We're really struggling now to work on some of the Texas state senators, and I think we have our work cut out for us. I think it is very difficult to explain how grids work and why using an electron of energy at overnight in West Texas is not the same thing as using an electron of energy at 4 p.m. in Dallas, Texas. Those are two very different things. And one of those is actually healthy for the grid because it creates more balance and consumes otherwise, low demand energy. And the other one of those is adding peak demand. If you're consuming at 4 p.m. in Dallas on an August day, you're adding to peak demand because those are peak demand moments. So it's a really tough challenge, and there's been a lot of negative press, unfortunately. So we've got our work cut out for us.
Yeah, it feels like a couple things. What you all explained there is makes me think of many things, but the one thing when it comes to energy is just like nuclear or, thorium, or like all these stories over the years where you've like companies attacking it, right? Because it's like, oh, shoot, it's going to take us out of business, or, we're going to have a much less business. It makes me think of the food companies, advertising against healthy options, like, no, take my sugar, stuff like that. So I think that's the one thing, like, again, you and I are around a similar age, and I think that's what the younger generations are just completely sick of. I think it was something you mentioned in the interview you did a year ago with Peter McCormick, and you were talking about how in Texas you had some really interesting stats about the age of people owning, Bitcoin or crypto, and how most of them were actually Democrat leaning, and just kind of it being like a tech thing where the younger generations tend to lean more Democrat, but they also might be more, I don't know if tech advanced or tech savvy necessarily, but that's, I don't know, the best way to say it maybe. So I think that, to me, I don't know what you're seeing out there for this stuff and the research you guys put out there, but I'd love for you to kind of maybe shed some light on that, of what you guys are seeing just to this transition. I always think of it as the hippie bubble. Like, the hippies are in power right now. The hippie kids of the 60s, stuff like that, they're in power everywhere, right? Academia, politics, everywhere you look. But eventually they are there's a sunset to that, right? They go and leave power, and then the younger generations come about. So I think like that education gap and people fighting against this system and fighting for the good option, Bitcoin, or healthy foods, whatever it might be, it's just fascinating. But it's gonna flip, I think, a lot faster than people realize. So I would love for you to shed some light on that, even just in the data you're seeing in terms of that.
We want to thank our sponsor. This show is presented by Bitcoin Trading Cards, an orange pill in a pack, making talking about things that normally make you want to cry fun and easy. The scarcest and most educational cards to ever exist. Available now.
Yeah, happy to. This is some polling data that we commissioned through a third-party polling agency. And, we found that 42% of people under the age of 29 in Texas own digital assets. And so the way it breaks down is kind of interesting. It's more demographic than political. There just happens to be more young Democrats than young Republicans, or more younger progressives, I should say, than younger conservatives. Yeah. I'll use those terms. So what I would say is young conservatives are very pro Bitcoin. Young Democrats are also pro Bitcoin. When you get up in the age range, older conservatives tend to be anti-Bitcoin because they came of age in the time when the dollar, Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard, and they're kind of more interested in either gold or the dollar remaining the world's reserve currency. And they've heard some of these narratives that Bitcoin might compete with the dollar as a reserve currency asset one day. Of course, the way that I talk to Texas elected officials about that is, that may happen, but we'll all be dead by the time that happens. What we want is Bitcoin to, the U.S. to embrace Bitcoin so that the dollar can use that strength, the hard money narrative and strength to strengthen other central banks' confidence in the U.S. financial position, such that the demand for dollars increases, and the U.S. dollar remains the world's reserve currency for a few more decades, right? We don't have that much more time. Like if we continue on our current trajectory, the dollar will lose its reserve currency status. It'll still be amongst the basket of currencies. In fact, the dollar is really strong right now relative to other currencies. But say 10 years from now, the dollar drops that reserve currency status. It'd still be in the basket of reserve currencies that are throughout the world. It just wouldn't be the sole like dollar is king petrodollar that we know today. But I think if the U.S. embraces Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, and probably more importantly, tightens our fiscal and monetary policy a little bit and become a little bit more responsible in that way, we can prolong the dollar as the world's currency for years to come. And, the argument about Bitcoin competing with the dollar, I just push that off into the future and say, elected official, whoever you are, we'll all be dead at that point. And that's a challenge for younger generations to cope with. But I know that's sort of maybe a unique take or a hot take, but that's the way I typically describe it to elected officials.
Speaking of that, and I want to touch on something else you said, Peter, too, in a few minutes about the miners and the importance of them running at 2 a.m. and things of that nature and stabilizing the grid. But speaking of orange pilling politicians, what has it been like, whether it's talking to Governor Abbott or Senator Cruz? I know you've had some back and forth with Senator Warren, some people outside of the state of Texas as well. What is it like, whether it's state representatives or whatever it is, orange pilling and helping to educate the politicians? Have you seen them being receptive? I mean, what is the temperature? When you take their temperature on like, hey, how much do you know? What do you about mining or just Bitcoin itself? What has that experience been like the last few years?
Yeah, it's been interesting. Governor Abbott, he was the first one that we were working on, and we gave him a copy of the Bitcoin Standard signed by Saif Dean, the author, obviously, of that book. Shout out to Parker Lewis. He's the one that gave me the signed copy to give to Governor Abbott. He had the forethought to get a signed copy from Saif Dean that said to Governor Abbott, and then Saif Dean wrote a note in there, signed it. I think it took about a year or two, maybe. And then I texted Parker and said, hey, I'm going to meet with Governor Abbott today. He said, swing by. I'm going to give you a book for him that's signed. Wow. Anyways, I doubt he's read much of that. He's a very busy person, but hopefully he's read a little bit of it. And I think he understands Bitcoin better than the average American, certainly. What he understands more is the grid. He's been taking, ever since the Winter Storm Uri in Texas, he's been taking a very intense interest in the grid. And so he certainly understands demand response. He understands how ERCOT operates. He understands, I think he mostly understands how Bitcoin miners operate on the grid. There's a lot of FUD out there that has clouded probably his all the information that he gets about Bitcoin mining. I mean, I've only been able to spend time with him on 3 or 4 different occasions, but he's getting constant news articles. And, there was a comic in the Dallas Morning News, which is a widely read publication in Texas, showing Bitcoin miners standing on an electrical grid, juggling bags of money. And basically the impression was Bitcoin miners are, damaging the grid at everyone else's expense and making a bunch of money off of it. So the amount of negative press that we've received is astounding. And so there's no way that he has been immune to all that. He's got people texting him those articles. And so we're in a constant education battle. And I think Senator Cruz probably understands it the most. He understands the value of Bitcoin the most, for sure. Because he's read all the books, and we've had him speak the last 3 years in a row at our conference, and he has demonstrated some incredible, probably the most educated elected official on Bitcoin next to maybe Patrick McHenry or Tom Emmer or Richie Torres or some of those folks, right? So, we just have a different challenge with the state level elected officials versus the federal elected officials, because the state level elected officials deal with matters pertaining to mining and the grid. And the federal elected officials are obviously dealing with matters like central bank digital currencies, the Fed,
Mm-hmm.
So it's two different conversations. It's sort of a unique experience.
Yeah, that's incredible. So speaking of, miners being on, stabilizing the grid, being on at 2 a.m. again, I think it was an example you kind of gave with Peter, a year ago, and you just mentioned ERCOT too. And then this is something that has just come up in the last month or so. A lot of people are hearing a lot about this. I'm sure there's a lot of Bitcoiners that don't necessarily know particularly the ins and outs of the Texas grid and what's going on there. But could you explain, ERCOT? And literally what's been happening, I guess, the last couple of weeks, and why this has been in the news, and the importance of the last few years of miners. And again, explaining it to people like they're five, I guess, what is happening, why is it important that the miners are on, and how I think the other interesting thing too that Peter was saying, like, because he was like, yeah, and I think we all thought this at some point, where it's like, it's not someone calling and saying, hey, can you shut those miners off, right? When we need to, move load somewhere else, it's, just the markets do that themselves. So I would love for you to explain ERCOT and the markets and how it's stabilizing the grid there, and just, spend a couple minutes just kind of talking about that. Because again, I think it's something that's so important, yet so few people really know what's actually happening.
Sure. Yeah. ERCOT is the ISO that covers Texas. There's various ISOs around, grid operators, if you will. It's just another term for it, around the country. Up where you are, it's probably PJM that handles the grid up in the upper Midwest. But yeah, you've got CAISO in California, PJM in the Midwest. You've got the New York ISO in the New England. And they're all in a spectrum of allowing market forces to determine the price of energy in sort of the wholesale market or the day-to-day market. ERCOT is probably the most deregulated in the market, and has the largest impact on the ERCOT grid versus, say, CAISO or some of these other ISOs, where it's really more of a capacity market, where the grid operator buys future capacity to serve the grid, and the market doesn't have as much of an impact. There's not as many market forces at play to determine, like, minute by minute pricing, or I guess in ERCOT it's 5 minute by 5 minute pricing.
Mm-hmm.
So if people understand that, and they understand that, the grid in Texas is the most market oriented grid, with PJM being a close, second. It's also a pretty market oriented grid, which is why you have Bitcoin miners in Ohio, and you've got some miners in the Southeast as well, like Georgia, North Carolina. But the way the price signals work is every 5 minutes, if you're playing in the wholesale market, like, this doesn't work for like normal individuals at their houses, right? This is for large industrial consumers who are exposed to minute by minute or 5 minute interval price changes, right? I have an electric contract at my house that I have the same electricity price year round. And my retail electric provider manages the risk of, like, prices going above that and under that. And, they have some margins built in there to make some money off of me, right? So, but a miner is exposed to the spot price of power unless they have hedged their power out at great expense, right? They put collateral down, and people hear about this, right? Miners selling power back to the grid. Really what they're doing is, if they're able to sell power back, that means they bought power, a block of power looking forward into the future. And at that point in time, the price of power went above their break even, and they were able to trade that power in the power market, just like all power traders do. Bank of America has a big power trading desk, NRG, all of these companies. There's just lots of big power traders out there that deal in sort of the commodity of electricity, if you will. And so those markets are quite efficient. So when Bitcoin miners, say you don't have a hedge, which most miners in Texas don't have a hedge because it's very capital intense. So if you don't have a hedge, you're just taking the spot price. So every 5 minutes, you're watching that price. And if the price goes above your break even, which after the halving and where we are with hash price is going to be very low, like around $100 a megawatt hour. So if the price of power goes above that, and you think that it's going to go above that for, say, 15, 20, 30 minutes, then you're going to shut off your operation. Even if you're not selling power back to the grid, you're just going to be off to avoid those high power prices. You're avoiding, those high power prices so that you don't end up end up paying more for power than you did in mining Bitcoin. Now, if it's only going to spike up for like 5 minutes, is it really worth the risk of turning all your machines off and risking a couple of them being, especially if they're air cooled machines? They could be, there's a little bit of damage that happens with rapid temperature change on those circuit boards. So, if it's going to be a very short amount of time, there's all these risk calculus built into the way the miners think about that. But this summer in Texas, there's going to be a number of times when power gets up to $500 a megawatt hour, $1,000 a megawatt hour, because especially in cloudy days when the solar is not producing, and in that 7 to 9 p.m. timeframe when solar ramps down, but people are still using a lot of power to cool their homes. So post 9 p.m. we're fine, right? Everyone's ACs aren't really blowing anymore because the
Right.
air, the temperature is cooled off. Maybe they're blowing like once, for 5 minutes out of every 30 minutes, right? It's just not a constant on. Whereas at like 7 p.m. in Texas, the AC is almost always on at people's houses, and the power demand, we're going to hit peak power probably like 82, 83 gigawatts of power in Texas this summer. And that's really, that peak time is probably going to be either the sun wasn't shining that day and it's still hot, which means peak is probably going to come around 4 p.m. Or if the sun was shining and it's hot, then peak's going to come around 7 p.m., 8 p.m. when sun goes down, solar stops producing, and you're relying on just basically nuclear and natural gas in Texas. And it's most of that is natural gas, right? That is our base load power generation source in Texas is predominantly natural gas. Only about 8% of power in Texas is generated by nuclear. And it depends on the day. Like, because of the federal subsidy, if there's a lot of sun and a lot of wind, those are the primary. You can have wind and solar produce 50% of the power in Texas on a given day. I mean, wow. It's insane. But the variability and the risk of having a hot day with no wind is insane. Like, you have hot day with no wind and a little bit of cloud cover. That is like a worst case scenario for ERCOT. And prices of power are going to skyrocket. Our only generation source at that point is going to be natural gas. All the peaker plants are going to come on, and Bitcoin mining is going to come off, contributing more power to the grid. Now, Bitcoin miners aren't generating power, but by being on all of those other times, they are creating the economic situation where more power is being constructed and built. Right, you have to have those buyers of power in the overnight hours and the shoulder month hours to make it economical to build more generation. So, we're people that don't like Bitcoin miner are like, well, you're not actually giving any power back to the grid. In a sense, in the sense that we aren't generating power, that is correct. But because of our presence in all the other times, we are giving that power back to the grid, because that power wouldn't be there but for the miner.
Yeah, it wouldn't be. That's such an important point, an amazing point, and I think that's the nugget that a lot of people miss, or they don't explain, and what gets lost in translation. And it's that little part of it. And this is why I think people get confused when you have like the sailor who's kind of popularized it, or a lot of people will say Bitcoin is energy, things of that nature, right? Because there's nuance to that. And then you have the physicist people come in like, well, Bitcoin's not energy. What do you mean? And it's like they get caught up in like textbook definitions, and they're not seeing fourth dimensionally, right? Like, they're not seeing this transfer and what Bitcoin mining allows the grid to be able to do. And that's just like, that was it. So thank you for that line, because that was the best explanation for what is happening and how mining works and why it's so important. And this is why, again, we can you see like communities around the world. I'd love for you to touch on even like flared gas, or how it's cleaning up the environment, because this is, again, you and Peter talked about this too. where I think he had Jason Meyer on, or he was just about to interview him about the progressive case for Bitcoin, and why it's so important for the other side to read that book, and vice versa, right? And to do the other thing, because this is where it can start cleaning up all these issues that both sides has. And I would love for you to touch on just even what it's doing for the environment, what Bitcoin mining is allowing, the cleaning of the environment, but also this power usage to be able to build out cities. This is where I was going with this, is you hear people around the world saying, well, these little areas are an island, uninhabited place. Now you see communities starting to thrive there. So I'd love for you to touch on maybe Texas communities or places that maybe they were abandoned or they're starting to grow now because of Bitcoin mining and the usage of that there.
Yeah. Yeah. We've got some counties in Texas where Bitcoin miners are the largest employer. We've got 3 or 4 counties where Bitcoin miners are the largest taxpayer. In fact, in Dickens County in West Texas, Bitcoin mining doubled the tax base, literally doubled the tax base, the industrial tax base for the county and the school district and all that stuff. So it's transforming rural communities across Texas. And it's not just 1 or 2 counties. We're talking about probably 15 counties that are benefiting from this. Now Texas has 254 counties, right? So it's not a small place,
Right.
but these counties, they need these jobs, and 30, 40, 50 jobs in a rural county changes the economics of that county, right? That could be half the jobs in the whole county. A lot of people in these rural towns are, maybe they're ranchers, or they drive to a big city an hour one way and an hour back to get to a job. But if you've got a Bitcoin mining site and you're getting, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year pay plus 401k plus health insurance, that is really, really good and goes a long way. The cost of living in rural Texas is extremely low. So making $60,000 a year plus benefits is probably equivalent of making triple that if you live in like New York or California, right? So that's what we're doing for rural Texas, and of course rural places across the country. On the environmental side, there's really not enough flare gas mining yet to really say that we're putting a dent into the amount of flaring that's happening across the world, but it's growing, and it's important to note that there's really no other economical way to get that flare gas. So what happens is you've got an oil well that's pulling up some associated gas, right? They're there to get the oil because they can truck the oil out. There's no pipeline for the gas because it's way too expensive to build the pipeline just to take away some associated gas, or who knows how long the gas is going to be there. It's just gas that's coming up with the oil. And rather than letting that gas vent into the environment as methane, which is worse, environmentally worse, I think, I don't know, something like 10 times worse than carbon dioxide, you would want to burn that and burn it in a flare. So the associated gas is put in a flare stack and then lit on fire to burn that. So it's not being vented in the environment as methane. Well, even better than flaring it is redirecting that gas to an on-site generator, a 1 megawatt or a 3 megawatt generator that's powering on-site high-performance computing. And a lot of times Bitcoin miners are the only types of machines that are rugged enough to handle the environment of being put out there in a shipping container and operating and functioning properly, right? GPUs, NVIDIA GPUs are just probably need a little bit more care and a little bit higher quality data center. So we need to get more of that. I mean, I'm aware of a lot of sites. There's a lot of that happening. It's a really good narrative, but it could 10x. It could 100x. There's a ton of flare gas out there across the world. And most of it is actually international. The US is pretty much, we still have a lot of flare gas in Texas, but compared to like Nigeria, or other places around the world, we actually don't have that much. So flare gas mining in Texas could 10x, could probably 100x from where it is now. But across the world, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of the possibilities.
It's remarkable. It's like, when do people wake up, Lee? When do you, are you just waiting for like the iceberg to flip, like society to realize the importance? I was just listening to a story. It was, I don't know if it was Isabella Santos or like Adam O'Brien or somebody, I think it was Adam O'Brien of Bitcoin Well. And he was just talking about this guy in Costa Rica that he was cleaning up the pond there, and like they were taking their the restaurant was like dumping the grease or whatever into like the lake or the pond, and it was like destroying everything there. And the guy was like going down and scooping up, all the grease, or sorry, he was going to the restaurant and then saying, "Hey, can I take the grease?" And he would go like dumping in his like diesel, Bitcoin mining rig, and then like the pond started getting cleaned up, and like the wildlife's coming back, and he's mining Bitcoin. It's just like, man, like when do people wake up? Like you cross the event horizon, it feels so far away, yet like so close at the same time. Like it's just like this is humanity changing. Like what is going on? Like wake up. What is there any challenges? I'd be remiss if I didn't say, okay, it's not all peaches and cream. The work you guys do with the Texas Blockchain Council. What are the challenges, or what are the things that you are like, hey, maybe our detractors are right about this, or anything like that? Is there anything like that I always want to give credence to the other side of the argument, or contrast, I guess, maybe a better way to say it. But is there anything where you're like, hey, we need to be better here, or we can do this a little bit in a better fashion? Is there anything like that you guys are like, hey, we're working on this, and we got to clean this part up?
Yeah, and I hate to get kind of technical here, but I will, just to answer your question properly. Across the U.S., there are any large data center, there's a risk of what's called a low voltage fault, where the frequency on the grid drops, and you have a large data center trip off, because a lot of their machines trip off because they're built to operate at a certain frequency and a certain voltage. And so that is a concern for Bitcoin mining and data centers and any large industrial load, right? And now that we're having a lot more of those loads being built across the country, we're going to have to take, I guess, a lot more. We're going to pay more attention as an industry, data centers, again, everybody, about low voltage ride. It's called low voltage ride through. How do we make sure that we don't have these big facilities trip off? Because I think the risk there is, if you get a cascading trip where, a large facility trips off, the frequency drops even further, and then another facility trips off, and then you've got sort of a cascading effect, and the frequency is sort of in tailspin, and then you have all these trips. That can do a lot of damage to grid infrastructure and transmission lines. We're talking billions, and talking massive damage, right? Like many, many billions of dollars of damage. And also, not to mention like repair time, and like people being, without power for while that's being repaired. So that's probably the biggest area where a detractor might say, well, Bitcoin mining needs to be better at this. That's true. Everybody who interconnects to a grid needs to take into account, this being able to have those machines ride through. It's got NVIDIA GPUs. It's got to be at the machine level. Really, it's at the power supply level, right? Like those PDUs, and the machine power supply units as well, need to have a little bit more. And again, I'm outside my depth here, but they need to have more DC capacitors so that they can ride through these low voltage events. And I don't know, we don't really have the ability to communicate that to all the manufacturers yet, because it's just, especially NVIDIA, right? It's a huge company. They make GPUs, right? I think it's the largest publicly traded company in the US as of a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah.
They beat out Apple and Microsoft. That is a difficult thing to communicate to a company of that size. Like, hey, this is an issue. We've got to get we've all got to get better at this. What I'm afraid of is if there's an event like that and a Bitcoin miner trips off, even though they probably weren't the first one to trip off, they were just one of many that tripped. It's ingrained in the media's head to blame the Bitcoin miner. Mm-hmm. And if we're the scapegoat for something like that, that would be tragic.
Interesting. And it's because it's all money is. It's all really the economy is. It's psychology, right? So, I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It's perception, it's psychology. And that's the important fight here of education and stuff like that. So yeah, well said. Is there, somewhat tangentially related, but just the grid. This is something that I've heard people talk about over time. The just grid stability. This is obviously something that for really decades people have warned about, and just talking about grid stability, and our grid's so fragile, and the grid's so fragile, just nationally, not just Texas necessarily, right? But just nationally. Can you speak to, is there any way that Bitcoin can strengthen the grid? That's kind of a reach in a sense, but is there anything where Bitcoin, helps with that? That's again a question that I see from time to time people too, and I don't have an answer for it necessarily. But is there anything down that realm where Bitcoin, mining can be a use there?
Yeah, the first way is that Bitcoin miners need to locate, and they do locate because it's better economically for them, on the opposite side of grid congestion. So if you have insufficient transmission lines to get the power from where it's being generated to the power draws, then locating on the generation side of that congestion point is very helpful, right? Because then you're decongesting the grid. As far as strengthening the grid, the best way is to work with the grid operator to be sort of a capacitor, right? The thing that stands in the way for that is it's sort of nuanced, but miners have to be, in Texas, we call it, they have to be participants in security constrained economic dispatch. And in other places, they probably have different acronyms for it. We call it SCED. Yeah, security constrained economic dispatch. So that is a point at which a miner will curtail their consumption, and the grid operator is well aware of that point. And so when prices hit that point, they curtail. The problem with that is it's kind of nuanced in that there's some operational risk to the miner. If you're not in SCED, you can just curtail sort of whenever you want to. So being in SCED allows the grid to be strengthened more by Bitcoin mining. It's definitely good when Bitcoin miners use economic curtailment and just turn off when prices go high. That's certainly helpful, but it's not as helpful as being in SCED, because then ERCOT can count on that load dropping off, and it acts more like a demand side battery or a capacitor in a much more nuanced way. And so I think once we get, that's going to take a couple years, but once we get this load in that category across the country, then we're going to see tremendous benefits for the grid. Essentially, it should be the same amount of benefit for the grid as a battery, because a battery provides that on the demand side or on the supply side, whereas a miner provides it on the demand side. And one might actually argue that a Bitcoin miner is better than a battery, because batteries can only just discharge for between 1 and 4 hours. Most batteries, are discharge their electricity for an hour or 2, 4 at the most. Like that's max. A Bitcoin miner can turn off indefinitely. They can turn off for days if there's a prolonged heat wave or winter storm. They don't need to charge. Right. So if you had that demand in the good time when power was plentiful, it encouraged the building of more generation. And then if you need to turn off for like 3 or 4 days, you can. A battery can't do that.
Yeah, so interesting. Again, it makes me think of just the Bitcoin is energy type of thing, right? It's indirect help. It's not like you said, it's there to help everything that's going on. It's not just say, hey, this is the only source of help. It's there to indirectly help everything, the ecosystem, I guess, maybe the best way to say it. So yeah, man, that's really fascinating. Is there segueing just a tiny bit? We were talking about NVIDIA, chips, things of that nature, mining rigs. Any update on? I haven't looked at this in a while, but mining rigs being built here in the USA, or I guess, just in the Western hemisphere, do you have any updates on that at all, or any data that shows that maybe we're trending in the right direction?
Yeah, we certainly are. I mean, the two largest manufacturers of ASIC miners are Bitmain and MicroBT. They are both either already building or looking very seriously at manufacturing in the United States. So I think that's a positive sign. So excited about that. And then also there are some U.S. manufacturers like Auradine and others that are designing their U.S. companies building here, and so they may ironically they probably will design here and be a U.S. company, but perhaps they'll have it manufactured at a Flextronics facility in Mexico or something like that, right? So it's an interesting supply chain is an interesting thing. It's very complex, and you can't do everything in the U.S., but a lot of the mining manufacturers are seeing the value of manufacturing more in the U.S., and so I'm very excited to see that.
That's very good. Good news. Great news. So the Texas Blockchain Council, what is it? If you could explain to everyone what it is you guys do, because we've kind of touched on a lot of things. I mean, at this point, if someone doesn't know you or hasn't really paid attention, I guess for the first 40 so minutes or whatever, you can kind of guess maybe what you do. But what is the mission of the Texas Blockchain Council and everyone that works with you? And Lee is the president of the council. So what is it the mission is, and what you guys are trying to do day in and day out?
We're a 501c6 trade association. So that's a nonprofit, but not a charitable nonprofit. It's a nonprofit that works like a chamber of commerce. And our mission is to make Texas the jurisdiction of choice for Bitcoin, blockchain, and digital assets. We do that through advocacy, through lobbying. Because we are a C6 nonprofit, we can lobby and we can make endorsements in political races, whereas a 501c3 nonprofit cannot do that because of their tax status. So we operate like a regular business, but kind of like your city chamber of commerce would, and we advocate on behalf of the industry and behalf of our members. We have about 90 corporate members and several hundred individual members, and so that's kind of what we've been up to the last 5 years.
That's very cool. How can people help you guys and support you guys?
The best way is to come to our conference in the fall. We have a North American Blockchain Summit every November, and this year it's going to be at the Bush Presidential Library in Dallas, Texas. Of course, you'll see the CEOs from all the big mining companies. It's a pretty business to business conference. It's different from like Nashville, Bitcoin Nashville in that way, right? That's a huge conference, lots of people. Ours is going to be smaller. Our largest attendance at our conference has been 1,200 people. So probably a tenth of the size of Bitcoin Nashville, which will be at Bitcoin Nashville, and would love to connect with people there. And so both are awesome events. But if you want to support the TBC, then joining us at one of our conferences and kind of plugging into the community would be a great way to do it.
Love that. I would love for you, if you can, to give some inside baseball of the last. I mean, I'm sure it's been weeks and months. However, again, the Trump coming out, the Biden administration kind of flipping on its head, turning on a dime, I guess, if you will. What have the talks been like there? I mean, have you guys been talking to, whether it's you guys, ERCOT, whatever? I mean, has there been talks going on for weeks, months? How did this come about? Because it seemingly, to the community, I guess, came out of nowhere in a way. I know a bunch of people that have ties to mainly the Trump administration, and like either grew up with their kids, like went to school with them and stuff like that. And they've been talking about this for a while now, I think for a couple of years, just like to the ecosystem of Trump and things like that. People are pretty close to him. But what was the involvement, I guess, for you guys, if you can share any inside baseball of what that's kind of been like?
Yeah, I'd say, again, a pretty big difference between the federal elected officials and state level elected officials. So with Trump and Biden, the only impact that we could have possibly had on Trump is we hosted Vivek Ramaswamy for our last North American Blockchain Summit, and got to spend some time with him. Obviously, he's very pro Bitcoin and pro digital assets, and I think he delivered his U.S. digital assets policy platform at our conference for the very first time. Mm-hmm. And so I think Vivek has had, and it's actually pronounced Vivek. Most people say Vivek, but he told me that it was Vivek, like cake, and so that's always stuck. But I think Vivek's had a big impact on President Trump, former President Trump. But that's really the only interaction that I've had. I've never personally interacted with President Trump, although some of our members have. I know many of our members met with him a couple of weeks ago at Mar-a-Lago. Miners from CleanSpark and Marathon and Riot and several others, I think Galaxy and others. So
Cool.
good group that got to connect with him, and he's obviously seen the light, and it's going to be a political issue. And I think the polling experts in the Biden administration have seen that, and they've seen if Trump hadn't taken up the banner, they probably wouldn't have touched it. But now that he has, they're going to have to abandon Elizabeth Warren, because there is no anti-crypto army. There's nobody that's a single issue voter against the digital asset industry, right? There are hundreds of thousands, even possibly millions of US voters that are pro digital assets. And so, it was a boneheaded move to start with for the Biden administration to be so antagonistic. And, I think you can mostly see it in the SEC's flip, like the fact that, and also the fact that the Biden administration said that they were not going to veto Fit 21. And you had so many Democrats, especially young Democrats, vote for that bill. Absolutely astonishing to me. Wow. I mean, and it proves all along that this has been an internal debate within the Democratic Party, with Elizabeth Warren winning out up until about 3 weeks, maybe say a month ago. And then since then, the Richie Torreses, the younger Democrats in the Democratic Party have said, hey, this is a losing issue if we come out against this. We're already, many of us have already understand it and are for it. And so I think Elizabeth Warren has just lost a lot of her credibility, especially amongst the staffers in the Biden administration, who have seen like, we're probably going to lose the election in November because of a lot of factors. But if we also tack on, the digital asset industry as a anti-Democrat vote, we're definitely going to lose. I mean, the betting markets have Trump at a 75% chance of winning. So they can't afford to bleed even a few thousand votes in some of these swing states, and they've already lost most of them.
So true. I know we only got about 5 minutes here. What's your quick story? Because I want to do a little lightning round, a little segment at the end, just kind of quick, one word answer if you can, just kind of wrap up here, a little fun little game. But what's your story to Bitcoin? I mean, like what was, were you interested in money as a kid? What led you to Bitcoin? I'd love for you to give it a minute on that.
Sure. Yeah, I do have to drop here in about 2 minutes, but I'll give you a quick. So I was a political science professor before I started the TBC, and I researched property rights. So property rights was my academic area of research, and I was up at the Army War College in Pennsylvania working on a paper on property rights, and I discovered the Bitcoin white paper, and I discovered digital scarcity. Obviously, digital scarcity didn't exist before Bitcoin, so that's how I got into it.
Wow, that is so cool. All right, I know you got to drop. We will do next time. Maybe in Nashville, we'll do a quick little segment with you. We'll do the words. I'll save all these the lightning round for you. So that'll be fun.
That'd be great. Yeah, we're hosting an event in Nashville at a pinball place, like a bar and a pinball place right outside of the convention center during Bitcoin Nashville. So we'd love for you to come out and join us there, and any of your guests as well.
We'll do. I'll bring Murph, my camera guy, and we'll have some fun. Where can people find you?
I'm just at Lee_Bratcher on Twitter.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lee. I appreciate you being a playable character and doing Satoshi's work. Thank you so much, brother. I appreciate you.
Yeah, no problem, Brandon. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for checking out this episode of the Playable Characters Show, brought to you by Bitcoin Trading Cards. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the future Bitcoin and financial experts we have on the show. Plus, we will be doing random big giveaways throughout different moments of shows of collectible cards, sats, merch, and more from guests, so you won't miss anything. This show does not constitute any investment advice, only freedom advice. Everything you see here is opinions from the host and the guests themselves, nothing further. Please don't trust, verify. For full transparency, I do lead marketing efforts at Bitcoin Trading Cards, where we are trying to spread freedom to all of humanity and orange pill the world, one collectible physical trading card at a time, by making things fun and easy to talk about that normally make you want to cry. You can reach me directly through my email, brandon@btc-cards.com, with any inquiries or playable character suggestions. See you on the next one.